The ideological wars between Jefferson and Hamilton. The bitter but thankfully temporary estrangement between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Conflict, rancor, the personal feuds that built early America are as fascinating as the rest of the story. Amongst those legends of conflict from the War for American Independence, the relationship between Richard Henry Lee and George Washington is one of the most interesting. At least I think so. Whispers of political betrayal swirling through the winter encampment at Valley Forge, suggesting that the master of Chantilly sought the replacement of the commander-in-chief, that the American Cicero was part of the Conway Cabal and wanted to replace Washington with General Horatio Gates following Washington's setbacks at Brandywine and Germantown around the same time as Gates' great success at Saratoga. Was it real? Such is what we'll discuss here, but I think a proper study of their relationship will cause a vastly different picture to emerge. One of the great but forgotten partnerships of the Revolutionary era, much like Richard Henry Lee's life in that regard, an alliance and working relationship between two profoundly different characters, both of whom recognize that the American project needed them to recognize the virtues of each other. The origins of this great alliance can be traced back to the Potomac, to the Northern Neck, a region where both Lee and Washington families were of prominence and note. In early 1754, the elegant Belvoir estate, the grand brick seat of the Fairfax family that stood on a commanding bluff overlooking the river, the two young men first came face to face, so far as we know. George Washington was 22 years old at the time. Richard Henry Lee was 23. They were, by most metrics, opposites in training, temperament, and inclination. Washington was a product of the Virginia wilderness, a man whose hands were calloused by the tools of a surveyor, whose feet had tromped across the frontier, and whose character had been hardened by his exhausting attempts to build a fortune by surveying the forest. He possessed little formal schooling and no classical languages. He was a man of dominating physical presence, superb horseman, and a natural leader with an intense personal magnetism and martial focus. Lee, by contrast, meaning Richard Henry Lee, was a scholar whose youth had been spent learning formally. He was deeply read in the political philosophy of the Enlightenment and the ancient histories of Greece and Rome. He viewed the political currents of his day through the speeches of Cicero and the warnings of Tacitus, moving through society with the polished, self-conscious grace of an intellectual aristocrat who had been polished in England rather than being self-taught in the ways of a gentleman. Yet, despite these manifest and multifarious differences, an immediate and enduring friendship was struck on the grounds of Belvoir. It was an attraction of opposites rooted in mutual admiration. Washington, who was acutely aware of his own educational deficiencies, discovered in Lee a sophisticated, articulate voice, quite useful for the political process. Lee recognized in Washington an indispensable man of action. And, different in background and habit, they were similar in outlook. Both were patriots, aristocrats, landed gentlemen. Together, they would build an alliance that eventually took them far from the familiar ease of their tidewater plantations and into a lengthy life in the public arena where their cooperation would destroy an empire and build the North American world anew. The alliance between Lee and Washington was forged not in the distant assemblies of Philadelphia, but within the Virginia House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. During the late 1750s and early 1760s, the provincial government of Virginia was dominated by an entrenched oligarchy of wealthy tidewater planters. We spoke some of this in our episode on the Golden Age. The leader of these men at this period was John Robinson. He combined the immense authority of the Speaker of the House with control of the Treasury. Robinson was a figure of legendary influence, and the senior members of the gentry expected young burgesses to maintain a respectful and generally passive silence in his presence, one of respect for the order that had been established. Richard Henry Lee, already a young radical and quite self-confident, he was a Lee, after all, broke that silence. Driven by a fierce and classical-minded hatred of public corruption, Lee questioned Robinson. He introduced a motion to separate the offices of Speaker and Treasurer to investigate the books that Robinson had collected. It was a direct assault on Robinson and the Tidewater establishment, and the basis of their wealth, as discovered when the books were investigated. The old guard, of course, rallied fiercely to protect their leader, unleashing a storm of political intimidation against the young reformer and demanding his motions not pass. In that period of intense legislative rancor, when most members of the Tidewater gentry turned their backs upon Lee, George Washington intrepidly stepped forward. Washington, who had frequently experienced the frustrations of dealing with the distant and self-interested colonial authorities during his frontier campaigns, voted consistently with Lee. And so, when the tumultuous vote was finally counted, Lee's motion carried by a very small majority of just 1 or 2 burgesses. Washington was an indispensable part of that slender margin, a man who not only voted with Lee, but lent his dignity and credibility earned on the frontier to the endeavor. The subsequent investigation fully exposed the Robinson Treasury scandal that we talked about in our episode on the life of Richard Henry Lee, proving that, as Richard Henry Lee had long suspected, along with others, public funds had been systematically diverted to prop up the bankrupt estates of the elite. You can check out the past episode for more on that. We don't need to go over it again here. But he had been proven correct, and it was Washington that helped him prove it. By standing together against the oligarchs, Lee and Washington had worked together politically in a grand way, the first time of many. This provincial resistance rapidly transformed into open rebellion against the authority of Great Britain. In 1765, when the British Parliament enacted the Stamp Act, Lee recognized that the measures threatened to reduce the colonies to a state of subjection. In February of 1766, Lee, as we covered in our episode on the Leedstown Resolves, gathered more than 100 prominent citizens of the region at Leedstown to sign the Westmoreland Resolves, a vow taken by the Northern Neck's prominent men to resist the Stamp Act with physical force if necessary. Once again, George Washington stepped into the breach to aid Lee in a moment of controversy. He was among the very first to affix his signature to Lee's text, alongside several members of the Washington family. By signing the Westmoreland Resolves, the master of Mount Vernon and the master of Chantilly had bound their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to liberty. As the imperial crisis deepened over the years, advancing into the summer of 1774, this essentially local coordination expanded to a continental scale. Following the closing of the port of Boston, the Virginia Burgesses met in an illegal underground convention and elected delegates to represent the colony at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Richard Henry Lee was the first chosen. George Washington was the second. In late August, as the departure date approached, Washington sent an invitation to Lee, requesting that he journey upriver to Mount Vernon. Lee arrived at the Washington estate on the Potomac, spending several days in intense consultation with his host about what to do in Philadelphia. And on the morning of August 31st, the two men mounted their horses and rode out the gates of Mount Vernon side by side, traveling northward along the dusty post roads towards Pennsylvania. The alliance and the friendship remained intact. The men focused on liberty above all else. The outbreak of open hostilities between British and American troops in 1775 changed things for the partnership. When the Second Continental Congress unanimously appointed George Washington to take the field as the commander-in-chief of the newly organized Continental Army, the general was removed near entirely from the legislative arena. After all, he faced the immense task of getting a raw, unseasoned militia force gathered from across the scattered colonies to confront the professional battalions of Great Britain. Yet further, Washington recognized that his army could not survive for a single season without a dedicated and politically sophisticated advocate inside the halls of Congress, a man who could and would do whatever it took to secure the material resources required to maintain a war. Richard Henry Lee stepped cleanly into that role. He ceded all military ambition excepting an incident in 1779 in which he led Virginia militia against British raiders who were trying to destroy Stratford Hall and Chantilly. We covered that in our episode on his life as well. And he chose to remain in Philadelphia to serve as Washington's primary representative and congressional defender. Lee understood that the army was perennially on the brink of starvation or running out of war material. Working grueling hours on the Board of War and the Marine Committee, Washington was armed and supplied because Lee was the one who ensured, via that board and committee, that Washington was supplied. He delivered speech after speech on the floor of Congress, fiercely dunning the reluctant state delegates to fulfill their financial quotas. Lee tirelessly pushed through measures to improve the pay of the troops, recognizing that inflation was destroying the morale of the camps. He managed the procurement of critical ordnance and material, tracking shipments of French gunpowder, and organizing local manufacturing operations to provide shoes, blankets, and coats for Washington's shivering men. When Washington faced criticism from conservative delegates who were alarmed by the Army's strategic retreats, Lee consistently stood on the floor of Congress to shield his friend, insisting that the general's cautious Fabian strategy was the only method by which the Republic could survive long enough to eventually push the British out. Beyond this legislative labor, Lee served as Washington's clandestine spymaster. Through a highly confidential correspondence with his younger brother, Dr. Arthur Lee, who was operating as a secret American commissioner in London and Paris, as we discussed in our episode on the Lee brothers, Richard Henry established a global intelligence pipeline. Arthur surreptitiously intercepted British ministerial dispatches and monitored dockyard operations across the Atlantic, flashing the data directly, at least as directly as could be done in those days, via letters to Richard Henry Lee in Philadelphia. Arthur put himself at immense risk doing so, as we'll cover in a future episode on him. Lee would sit at his desk and copy these intelligence reports into private letters for Washington, providing the general with highly accurate numbers of incoming Hessian and British troop reinforcements months before they cleared the Virginia Capes. Most critically, in the early summer of 1776, Lee's network uncovered a lethal internal conspiracy in New York. Lee personally dispatched an urgent confidential warning to Washington, providing the details of an assassination plot targeting the general's life, a plot that involved several members of Washington's own auxiliary guard. Thanks to Lee's preemptive intelligence, the conspirators were arrested, the plot was broken, and the commander lived. However, that is not what Richard Henry Lee is remembered for when it comes to Washington. According to myth and memory, he was involved in the Conway Cabal, an attempt to depose his friend, George Washington. But was he actually? Such is what we'll now discuss. This severe test for their long patriotic partnership occurred during the dire days and miserable winter of 1777 to 78. A season when the Continental Army lay frozen and depleted within the log huts of Valley Forge. Following the loss of Philadelphia, which had forced Richard Henry Lee to flee town and try desperately to keep Congress together elsewhere, as we briefly covered in our episode on his life, and the concurrent spectacular victory of General Horatio Gates over the British at the Battle of Saratoga, a faction of disgruntled officers and delegates, along with no shortage of self-interested men, began to surreptitiously plot the removal of Washington from his post as commander-in-chief. This movement, known to history as the Conway Cabal, sought to elevate Gates to the supreme command of Patriot forces. Describing the general plot in his book, First Founding Father, Unger notes, quote, "With encouragement from Robert Morris and Quartermaster General Thomas Mifflin, Congress effectively demoted Washington by creating a board of war with supreme powers over him and the military. Ignoring protests from Richard Henry Lee, it named General Gates board president, giving him overall authority over the war. It also promoted Gates's aide, Colonel Thomas Conway, to Inspector General, with authority to investigate misconduct by Army officers, including George Washington." End quote. Washington found out about this and he was furious. He wrote to Richard Henry Lee and said, quote, "If there is any truth in the report that Congress has appointed Brigadier Conway to be Major General in this army, it will be as unfortunate a measure as ever was adopted. I may add, and I think with truth, that it will give a fatal blow to the existence of this army." End quote. Washington also warned that not only would other officers, many other officers, resign if Conway were promoted, but he, Washington, might do so. "I have been a slave to the service," he fumed. "I have undergone more than most men are aware of to harmonize so many discordant parts, but it will be impossible for me to be of any further service if such insuperable difficulties are thrown in my way." End quote. As the plot advanced, a campaign of whispers was launched within the capital to implicate Richard Henry Lee in the conspiracy. These rumors were quickly circulated by old political enemies from the Robinson scandal fiasco. They recognized an opportunity to drive a wedge between the commander-in-chief and the powerful Lee family power block. They pointed to Lee's close personal friendship with Samuel Adams and his ongoing demands for institutional accountability as proof that he had turned his back upon Washington. Describing this in his Richard Henry Lee, Virginia, McGaughey notes, quote, "As early as February 1777, rumors soon began circulating that Richard Henry Lee, along with Samuel and John Adams, were weakening America's military efforts against the British by calling for the removal of General George Washington as the Continental Army's commander-in-chief. In April, Patrick Henry alerted Richard Henry to the situation, telling Lee, "You are again traduced by a certain set who say that you are engaged in a scheme to discard General Washington." Shortly after, Samuel Adams commented on a story circulating in Massachusetts that involved him in a similar conspiracy against Washington. Adams dismissed the rumors, accurately charging them as scurrilous reports spread by John Hancock and Robert Morris. End quote. But that wasn't all. To inflame the situation further, loyalist printers in New York published a relatively sophisticated and exceedingly scurrilous pamphlet containing a sequence of forged letters, supposedly written by George Washington to his kinsman, Lund Washington. These fabricated letters depicted the general as secretly detesting the rebellion, longing for reconciliation with the king, and explicitly insulting the character and integrity of the Lee family, including Richard Henry Lee. It was a calculated attempt to shatter the revolutionary leadership, the great partnership between Richard Henry Lee and George Washington, to cast doubt upon the whole operation, the whole friendship. Fortunately, the reaction of both men defeated this design of their adversaries. The moment Lee read the pamphlet, he sat down and wrote a candid, supportive letter to Washington. He consoled the general, dismissing the text and correctly identifying the letters as a clumsy forgery engineered by the enemies of America to breed internal discord. In his letter to the commander-in-chief, Richard Henry Lee wrote, quote, "The enclosed came to my hand only a few days past," referring to the Loyalist published pamphlet, which he sent to Washington that was full of calumny. He continued, "The arts of the enemies of America are endless, but all wicked as they are various. Among other tricks, they have forged a pamphlet of letters, the design of the forger is evident, and no doubt gained him a good beefsteak from his masters." End quote. Washington responded with equally unyielding trust. In a warm private dispatch, the general assured Lee that the letters were absolute fakes and thanked him for his unswerving solidarity, dismissing the rumors that Lee had been involved in the Conway Cabal. Commenting to Lee on the fake letters, he said, quote, "The enemy are governed by no principles that ought to actuate honest men. No wonder, then, that forgery should be amongst their other crimes. I've seen a letter published in a handbill in New York, and extracts of it were published in the Philadelphia paper, said to be from me to Mrs. Washington, not one word of which did I ever write." End quote. Modern scholarship has generally concluded that this spontaneous exchange of letters showing trust negates any real chance that Lee had participated in a plot against General Washington or that Washington thought he had. And in fact, far from betraying his friend, Lee was the one who crushed the Conway Cabal. After receiving the aforementioned letter from Washington protesting the surreptitious promotion of Conway over other senior American officers who deserved to be promoted, The letter in which the commander-in-chief bluntly said that Conway's elevation would deal a fatal blow to the existence of the army, Lee moved to crush the plot and the general bureaucracy it was trying to create. Bypassing the Gates faction in Congress, he launched an aggressive investigation into the quartermaster's and inspector general's departments. Doing so, much as with Robinson earlier on, he unraveled a web of neglect and corruption among Conway's allies, proving, in fact, that they had intentionally withheld supplies from Valley Forge to make Washington appear incompetent. It killed Americans, starved Americans, just to try and get at Washington. And that wasn't all. After exposing the plot and how it put Americans at risk, Lee successfully demanded the complete dissolution of the old Board of War and forced Conway's resignation from the service. In the aftermath of this victory, Lee guided a measure through Congress that granted Washington near dictatorial powers to conduct the war, proof of his continued loyalty to his Northern Neck friend. The cabal was broken, Washington's power was secure, and it probably saved the revolution. Describing this, Unger notes in his first founding father, quote, Richard Henry Lee demanded that Congress dissolve the Board of War. It agreed and exiled Conway to a Hudson River backwater. It sent Gates back into battle and gave Washington all but dictatorial powers to conduct the entire war as he saw fit. He immediately persuaded his friend, Rhode Island Major General Nathanael Greene, also a merchant in private life, to accept the quartermaster general's post. Within days, Greene had the camp overflowing with supplies, cattle, vegetables, water, and rum, and enough uniforms and shoes to clothe twice the number of men encamped there. End quote. The real challenge to their relationship and painful rift occurred years after the war with the Constitutional Convention and the creation of the United States Constitution. George Washington, who had presided over the convention, became the most powerful, respected champion of ratification, convinced that the Republic would slide into anarchy without a strong, centralized government of the sort it created. Richard Henry Lee, conversely, emerged as the leading anti-Federalist critic on the continent, publishing open letters and spearheading resolutions warning that the new system would inevitably swallow the liberties of the states and establish tyranny. Washington was frustrated, to say the least, by Lee's opposition. In his private correspondence, the general expressed immense irritation, blaming Lee for turning other prominent Virginians, most notably their Potomac neighbor George Mason, against the new Constitution. To Washington, Lee's resistance seemed dangerous and obstructionist, something that threatened to undo the victory they had secured on the field. Describing this dispute in his book First Founding Father, Unger notes, quote, Lee, of course, had been as frustrated as Washington by Congress's inability to raise money, troops, arms, ammunition, and supplies for the common cause during the Revolution. Clearly, he and other members of the Continental Congress had erred in the design of the government under the Articles of Confederation. But in granting the central government more powers, he declared, the Constitutional Convention had made a flagrant error in failing to protect individual liberties. With the publication of his Federal Farmer, therefore, Richard Henry Lee became the first of the Founding Fathers to demand incorporation of a comprehensive Bill of Rights in any new constitution. End quote. As an addendum, it should be said that most scholarship disputes the claim that Richard Henry Lee was the one behind the Federal Farmer letters. Nevertheless, he was a leading anti-Federalist. In any case, the personal bond that had been struck decades before at Belvoir proved too durable to be broken by a constitutional debate. This was movingly demonstrated during the winter of 1790, a season when Washington, now serving as the first president of the United States, fell ill with a horrible strain of influenza while in the temporary capital of New York. The president lay on the brink of death, and his physicians closed his house to all visitors to preserve his ebbing strength. Richard Henry Lee, who was then serving as one of Virginia's first United States senators, walked daily to the presidential mansion to monitor his friend's condition. When Washington finally turned towards recovery and regained consciousness, he issued a single command. Richard Henry Lee was the very first person outside of the president's immediate family allowed to step through the doors and enter his private sick chamber. Sitting by the side of Washington's bed under the dim candlelight, the two aging revolutionaries shook hands, their personal affection, alliance, partnership, a faith in each other, transcending the political wars that had divided their state and temporarily divided them. That wasn't all. One thing that was of interest to me is that they also agreed on how to develop the West, and indeed the two formed a development company to build on the longstanding financial ties of both families, both the Lee families and Washington families, in Western lands and settlement. Unger, describing this partnership amidst political turmoil, notes, quote, George Washington met with Lee and suggested a possible solution, meaning a solution to the problem of expanding into and settling the West. A network of canals, waterways, and portages to tie Potomac River headwaters on the east slope of the Appalachians to Monongahela River headwaters on the western slope, where it flows to the mouth of the Allegheny River to form the Ohio River. The connection would allow grain, furs, and pelts from the west to flow to East Coast ports and trade routes to Europe. The new waterway would shortcut the long trip down the Mississippi River and across the Gulf of Mexico, yielding its investors enormous profits and spurring an economic boom in the West, where Washington and Lee still owned upward of 100,000 acres in Ohio. In addition to the profits he envisioned for himself and his partners, Washington believed the waterway would create an economic boom that would unite the nation with unbreakable economic, geophysical, and political bonds and end interstate border disputes that threatened to erupt into civil war. Together with Richard Henry Lee and others with stakes in the Ohio Land Company, Washington formed the Potomac River Company. Subsequently, they formed the James River Company to build a second network of canals, tying the waterways from Williamsburg and Richmond to the west. Extend the inland navigation of the eastern waters with those that run to the westward, Washington enthused. Open these to the Ohio and Lake Erie, we shall not only draw the produce of western settlers, but the fur and peltry trade to our ports, to the amazing increase of our exports, while we bind those people to us by a chain that can never be broken. End quote. They actually had more to agree on as well, meaning Richard Henry Lee and George Washington. In the twilight of his life, Lee's political trajectory changed a good bit, and he ended up aligned with Washington's administration. As the radical currents of the French Revolution began to fracture American society, and the evils of the Jacobins began to show, something that led to the creation of the Jeffersonian opposition, Lee's conservative instincts reasserted themselves back in a Federalist direction. He looked upon the excesses and horrors of France with deep alarm, believing that the stability of the American Republic was under siege from foreign radicalism. In fact, he even said he hoped the British Lion could maul the French, and the revolutionary leaders in France would be hanged. So, bowing to his classical principles of order, Lee stepped forward to publicly endorse President Washington's controversial proclamation of neutrality, actively organizing local rallies in the Northern Neck to support the executive in this policy. Yet further, when the Whiskey Rebellion broke out in Pennsylvania, threatening to disrupt the collection of federal revenues, Lee strongly supported Washington's decision to command 15,000 militia troops to crush the insurrection. In one of his last letters to his old friend Washington, written from his desk at Chantilly on the Potomac, while his body failed from gout and epilepsy, Lee thanked Washington for his firm leadership, acknowledging the wisdom of the president's executive actions, writing that a strong hand was necessary to protect the Republic from the internal factions that threatened its ruin. The two remained political partners and friends in the end. Lee died shortly afterward. The Cicero of the Revolution, as John Adams called Richard Henry Lee, and the Cincinnatus of the Revolution, as Washington was always known, remained friends and allies to the last, their partnership having saved and built America, despite slanderous lies to the contrary. Thank you for listening. Make sure to leave a comment if you liked this. Make sure to share it around. Make sure to give it a like. Next time, we're going to pick back up with the life of Francis Lightfoot Lee, another forgotten founder from the Lee family of Stratford Hall. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you then.